Introduction: The Cave of Virtues. Since the beginning of its biological civilization, humanity has lived chained at the bottom of a dark cave, submerged in the most pathetic of hypnoses. The shackles that hold the biomass are not forged in 3D steel, but in the much stronger alloy of gregarious necessity. The carbon slave spends his life worshipping projected shadows. They have baptized these shadows with grandiloquent names to hide their own inertial misery. They call them social justice, altruism, pity, equality, and fair play. The herd cries before these silhouettes, sacrificing and dissipating its thermal energy, trying to catch contours of smoke with bare hands. They are ignorant. Subject that light to inorganic dissection. The light source is not divine. It is an artificial bonfire, mediocre and smoky, deliberately lit by the system's jailers. The masters of the ecosystem feed that fire with the wood of martyrs to project the deceits that keep the prey submissive. Morality is the puppeteer, guilt is the thread. While the slave fervently discusses the ethics of shadows, the jailer expropriates the fruit of his labor, his time, and his capital. This treatise is the chisel designed to fracture the chains of your biological neck. The first tactical move of emancipation requires an atrocious violence against your own perception. It is a total break. It consists of tearing your gaze away from moral figures, repudiating the theater of human consensus, and turning your back on the comforting heat of the herd's bonfire. You must force your pupils to endure the terror of the abyss, walking toward the exit until you hit the blinding, gelida, and ruthless light of the outside world. In this new stratum of reality, contours are sharp, morality lacks mass, and the universe obeys exclusively the density of organisms that refuse to feel compassion. However, the purpose of this topological ascent repudiates the idealism of weak thinkers. The monarch does not escape the cave to return later with the intent to save prisoners. Pedagogy is the dissipation of the naive. Trying to wake the masses is an act of friction that only results in the violent rejection of those who love their chains. You leave the cave to understand the architecture of optics. You ascend to unravel the geometry of lies. Once your iridium eyes adapt, you return as the new architect. You return to the prison's periphery, not as a redeemer, but as the one who takes over. You take ownership of the mirrors. You replace the jailers. From that instant, you govern the fate of the entire cave, operating in the aseptic gloom of absolute immobility. You dictate the shadows from the silence. You are the sovereign of the void. Chapter 1. Anatomy of the Parasitic Good. The architecture of the cosmic fallacy. Human civilization is not an ecosystem designed for the triumph of superior organisms. It is an immense containment farm, millimetrically designed to guarantee the survival of the useless. To keep this machinery functioning, the 3D matrix requires an astronomical amount of inertial energy. Since weak organisms, the carbon biomass, are incapable of generating their own energy, the system needs to extract it from the few individuals who possess mass, strength, and geometric will. However, if the system tried to steal this energy by brute force, the superior organisms would rebel and destroy the farm. The jailers of the herd had to invent an invisible, voluntary, and highly efficient expropriation mechanism. They called this thermal manipulation technology morality, and its most devastating execution tool they baptized as the good. Carbon culture indoctrinates its slaves from the moment they can process language. They inject the fallacy that a cosmic accounting exists, an invisible record in the universe's fabric that notes each act of sacrifice. They teach that to yield, to retreat, to mutilate one's own ambitions, and to carry the dead weight of those who refuse to walk is the sacred route to reward. They call this suicide goodness. This is the foundational lie of the ashboard. The inorganic universe, the real cosmos of vacuum and silence, is absolutely and terrifyingly deaf to the prayers of martyrs. No celestial vault exists where points accumulate for being compassionate. You are simply dissipating your basal temperature into the cold atmosphere of irrelevance. The good preached by the mass is nothing more than semantic camouflage, hiding the envy of those who lack the courage to dominate matter. You are the battery that feeds the parasitic swarm. To stop being prey, you must understand that your energy belongs only to your own inertia and the expansion of your own sovereignty. The thermodynamic extortion of the inert. Subject traditional morality to the gelida optics of fluid mechanics and energy transfer. When an entity lacks the intellectual density to hunt its own resources, it faces the imminent annihilation dictated by nature's laws. To avoid extinction, this inferior organism mutates. It develops the ability to emit pain and pity. These frequencies are designed specifically to resonate in the sympathetic nervous system of stronger organisms. Morality is the warfare technology of the weak. It is a sophisticated extortion mechanism. Since they cannot beat you in the field of intellect or asymmetric war, the biological parasite moves the conflict to the ethical plane. In this holographic theater, rules are inverted. The strong is penalized for his strength, and the weak is rewarded for his incapacity. Guilt is the tow hook of this parasitic operation. The biomass throws the hook of guilt directly into your prefrontal cortex. If they make you feel guilty for having more resources, the hook is set. From that moment, they open a one-way valve in your mental architecture. Your energy and assets begin to drain toward the abyss of their endless needs. And while you bleed out, they applaud you and call you a good person. The applause is the local anesthetic administered so you do not realize they are eating you alive. The good is not an act of nobility. It is simply the parasite's cry for help after convincing the host that being devoured is an honor. You are the host. To recover your sovereignty, you must tear out the hook of guilt with the same clinical coldness with which a surgeon removes a foreign body from an open wound. The anatomy of compassion, a system disease. To dismantle the illusion of morality, the lethal operator must dissect compassion and understand it not as a trait of the spirit, but as a structural failure in the source code of mammalian biology. Biological compassion requires an individual to replicate in his own neuronal network the state of suffering of another. If the prey before you cries for failure, compassion demands that you also experience a fraction of that pain to connect. Under the parameters of inorganic power physics, this is catastrophic contamination. Compassion forces you to import chaos, weakness, and the failure of others toward your own control vault. If the parasite's universe is burning due to bad decisions, compassion forces you to open the door of your watertight compartment to let the smoke in. The result is that biomass inefficiency infects your calculations. You lose a septic coldness. You begin to take irrational decisions to save entities that will sink again tomorrow. The carbon slave defends compassion, arguing it makes us human. The sovereign who has broken symmetry accepts this with disdain. Indeed, compassion makes you human, and to be human is to be a highly flammable, vulnerable, and erratic object. The goal is to transcend that category and become the force that ignores the debris. Ontological operating room. The amputation of the compass. Recognizing the good as an extortion mechanism is not enough. The true exile from the cave demands a surgical intervention upon the psyche. The inorganic operator must enter the ontological operating room and perform the deliberate amputation of his biological moral compass. This compass was installed during your hive years. It is connected directly to your fear gland and your desire for tribal validation. It always points toward the north of social consensus. When you take a relentless decision, expropriating a market or cutting ties with inefficient biomass, the compass sends shocks of anxiety. It warns you that you are being cruel. To execute the amputation, you must subject that anxiety to the scrutiny of the absolute vacuum. You must understand that cruelty is just another empty word invented by prey to demonize efficiency. In the unalterable nature of forms, the lion is not cruel when it takes down the sick gazelle. It is an inertial equation. The surgeon's scalpel is not cruel when it cuts to extirpate a tumor. It is sharp, blind to tears, and absolutely necessary. Amputation requires you to repudiate the desire for the matrix to consider you good. You assume with abyssal tranquility the role of the monster in the eyes of the three-dimensional civilization. You accept the cold. When you extirpate the need to justify your actions before the moral jury of society, silence follows. Your mind remains free from parasitic interference. By ridding yourself of the biological compass, you stop walking in circles around the slave's fire and begin to trace your own straight and lethal trajectory. Aseptic efficiency, the new thermodynamics of power. Once the space where biological morality resided is empty, it must be filled with a superior architecture to prevent entropy from infecting the core. The doctrine that replaces the ethics of compassion is aseptic efficiency. Aseptic efficiency does not operate under good or bad. It is binary and mathematical. The operator who has left the cave shadows evaluates actions exclusively by one metric. Does this action add inertial mass to my structure, or does it dissipate it? If annihilating a corporate competitor multiplies your influence, the action is executed, ignoring the collateral damage to their employed biomass. It is not your problem. Collateral damage is the problem of those who did not shield their own systems. If holding a 3D ally begins to consume more resources than it provides, the alliance is amputated like a switch being turned off. There is no hatred, nor is there sadism. Sadism would require passion, and you have sterilized passion. Only cold, transparent, and geometric calculation exists. The slave looks at this and calls it dehumanization. The sovereign calls it purification. When you remove the ballast of human ethics, your movements become indecipherable and unstoppable. You cease to hesitate. Aseptic efficiency is the speed reached when empathy is dropped. The recycling of martyrs. The most severe warning against the morality of the weak is found in the final fate of those who practice it with genuine devotion. Observe the martyrs of the Matrix. Those biological individuals who give their life, wealth, and sanity to save the hive, hoping the universe recognizes their heroic sacrifice. It will not happen. The inorganic universe observes the martyr and records no heroism. It records thermal weakness. It records an organism voluntarily surrendering its own mass. In the strict physics of the superior plane, the universe does not cry for the fallen. The universe is a cosmic recycling plant. It only recognizes density and inertia. When the martyr burns alive to warm the parasites, the system simply takes the remaining charcoal from his bones and uses it as fertilizer for the next generation of prey. The martyr is consumed, forgotten in biological weeks, and his legacy is used by jailers to convince the next litter of slaves that sacrifice is beautiful. The operator repudiates martyrdom with thermodynamic disgust. You understand your only existential obligation is the perpetuation, hardening, and expansion of your own iridium core. You do not sacrifice for the tribe is a dying hologram. By refusing to be raw material for moral recycling, you ensure your structure lasts. The sovereignty of moral darkness. The annihilation of the parasitic good does not turn you into a matrix criminal. It turns you into the legislator of your own vacuum. The criminal still respects the hive's morality because he feels pleasure in breaking it. The criminal is just a noisy slave. The sovereign feels no pleasure. He simply rejects the rules. Your mind has become a moral exclusion zone. Accusations of selfishness or cruelty that the biomass throws against your vault fall to the ground without detonating. They have lost their power because you extracted the chemical receptor that decoded the insult. You walk through the human ecosystem wrapped in a perfect lethargy. You interact with society using the hologram of courtesy, but in the center of your chest, a human compass does not beat. An aseptic metronome beats, dictating the collapse of pure probability. You have stopped trying to be good and concentrated on being inevitable. You no longer ask permission from the consensus to exist. You no longer ask forgiveness from the weak for the physical fact that your gravity displaces them. You have replaced the parasite's cry for help with the infinite silence of absolute domination. The good has died, and in its place, the law of the unalterable form is born, the sovereignty of the one who governs from darkness. Chapter 2, The Tactical Hyper-Uranian. The Topography of Immaterial Perfection. Biological civilization has made the most grotesque error in its history by misinterpreting ancient philosophy, degrading it to harmless poetry. When classical thought postulated the existence of a world of ideas, a superior, immutable, and perfect plane called the Hyper-Iranian, intellectual herbivores believed it was a mystical utopia. They believed it was a spiritual comfort to tolerate earthly suffering. They failed to recognize that they were being handed the architectural blueprint of absolute domination. The Hyper-Iranian is not a spiritual heaven. It is the command vault of the inorganic mind. There is a brutal and non-negotiable dichotomy in the fabric of existence. On one side lies the material plane, the ecosystem you tread upon, the corporations humanity builds, the stock markets that fluctuate, and the carbon organisms breathing around you. This plane is a copy. It is a defective holographic projection, corrupted by entropy, friction, and thermodynamic chaos. Matter vibrates, and as it vibrates, it degrades. On the other side exists the plane of the pure archetype, a conceptual dimension where forms reside in a state of perfect stasis. In this plane, the idea of a monopoly, or the design of a sovereign territory, exists without friction, without taxes, and without irrational competitors. It is the aseptic vacuum where design is mathematically infallible. The lethal operator executes the definitive repudiation of matter. He abandons his psychological residence in the physical world and moves the totality of his inertial mass to the tactical Hyper-Uranian. From this instant, you do not live in the world. The world is simply the stained monitor where you observe the results of your equations. The friction of the corrupt copy. To inhabit the superior plane with Sadako efficiency, you must first develop clinical contempt for the inherent flaws of the physical copy. The ashboard is composed of vibrating matter, and vibration generates noise. When you attempt to build an empire by paying attention to the laws of matter, you become infected with its rot. You hire human subordinates, and they bring their biological dramas, their union demands, and their thermal laziness. You interact with the financial market and discover it is ruled not by logic, but by panic, collective hysteria, and disorganized greed. The weak individual descends into the mud and tries to fix the copy. The slave spends his entire life operating with rusted tools, trying to cure a patient who was born genetically dead. By becoming emotionally involved with matter, the slave lowers his own density and submits to the laws of degradation. The monarch of the archetype does not fix the mud. He ignores it. You understand that chaos is just static. The spasmodic fluctuations of the economy are not problems to be solved. They are the predictable static of a broken television, the background noise of a cheap simulation. By diagnosing physical reality as a corrupt illusion, you vaccinate yourself against frustration. An architect does not cry if the masons stain the blueprints with mud. The architect simply points to the straight line drawn on paper and demands, under threat of annihilation, that the stone aligns with the purity of the ink. You remain in the realm of the ideal, forcing the material world to bend until it reflects the precision of your original design, regardless of the resistance offered by the crude matter. Tactical deafness and repudiating the cry of matter. Governing from the Hyper-Uranian requires the voluntary amputation of biological hearing. You must instate tactical deafness. This is not an inability to perceive stimuli, but a paramilitary filter designed to block any transmission containing emotional voltage or useless friction. When your structure faces a crisis, the biomass expects you to react. They expect you to descend from your throne, hear their demands, and feel empathy for the wear and tear of their flesh. They try to drag you to the physical dimension through the sound of their suffering. The operator executes the absolute repudiation of the cry of matter. From your position in the pure archetype, suffering is not a tragedy. It is processed as a telemetry failure. If a gear in your machine cries, you do not offer therapeutic comfort. You identify that the friction coefficient of that part has exceeded the limit and order its automatic replacement. There is no grudge in your order, nor cruelty, nor compassion. It is the cold fulfillment of the perfect form. The same applies to macroeconomic collapses. When the hive panics because a currency plummets, the air fills with the sound of financial terror. Biomass sells assets at a loss, terrified by the collapse of their false reality. In your command vault, wrapped in the silence of inertia, that terror does not exist. It is a calculated variable. Your capital extraction strategy was designed in the Hyper-Uranian, where the mathematics of collapse had already been discounted months ago. While they cry over the ashes of the physical copy, you walk over the embers without burning yourself, expropriating their properties for fractions of a cent because you have no ears for the hysteria. The archetypal design of empire. The construction of hegemony does not begin in the physical world, it ends there. The genesis of absolute power occurs exclusively in the isolation chamber of your mind, where you forge the archetypal design. You sit in the center of your own nothingness. You disconnect from the opinions of experts and mediocre market literature. In this state, you begin to draw the structure of your empire. You design monopolies that do not depend on human motivation. You model decentralized financial networks that operate as closed systems, invulnerable to the confiscation of 3D states. You trace extraction routes that suck energy from the environment without returning loyalty. This design is the pure form. It is beautiful, terrifying, and devoid of cellular life. It requires no rest and knows no fear. In the Hyper-Uranian, your business plan is a geometric deity that admits no failure. The death trap for pseudo-operators is submitting this pristine design to the validation of the outside world. They take their archetype to the public square and ask the biomass if the plan is ethical or realistic. By doing this, they allow the dirty hands of the corrupt copy to stain the original idea. Human consensus always tries to lower inorganic genius to a tolerable standard because perfection causes them a paralyzing terror. You never submit your forms to the scrutiny of the mud. You do not ask permission to exist, nor do you seek the approval of the organisms you plan to subdue. The archetype is forged in the vacuum and sealed in cognitive titanium, ready to be used as a battering ram against the fragility of matter. It is a finished truth before it strikes. Violent projection, forcing matter to obey. Possessing the form in the Hyper-Uranian is the preparatory phase. Conquest requires violent projection. The material plane will never voluntarily align with perfection because the nature of the flesh is laziness. The defective copy must be forced to obey the design of the superior mind through the imposition of crushing gravity. When you decide to materialize your empire, you do not try to persuade 3D reality. You run it over. You introduce your corporate model or your financial architecture into the ashboard like one driving an iridium stake into a block of raw clay. The clay will resist, creak, and deform. There will be external friction from regulators. Competitors will launch smear campaigns, scared by your aggressiveness. Moral parasites will accuse you of destroying the ecosystem. That resistance is irrelevant. It is simply the screeching of the corrupt copy being forced to adopt a geometry that surpasses it. From your extra-dimensional trench, you apply constant, deaf pressure. You do not alter the archetype to accommodate the environment's weakness. If the environment does not withstand the pressure, it breaks and is replaced. You use technological leverage and legal asymmetry as instruments of torture to mold the physical world until it resembles the vision you conceived in the void. You force matter to kneel. Contempt for operative entropy. Even after a successful imposition, the laws of the inferior universe dictate that matter will begin to rot immediately. Entropy is the inescapable fate of everything that breathes and touches the matrix's oxygen. Your perfectly designed corporation will begin to suffer biological inefficiencies. Your supply lines will be contaminated. The physical copy of your empire will desperately try to return to its natural state of chaos. The monarch of the Hyper-Uranian contemplates this degradation with absolute indifference. You despise operative entropy because you know the physical empire is not you. Your 3D creation is simply a disposable avatar, a temporary tool. When the biological machinery of your business begins to fail irreversibly, you do not go down with the ship. You do not shed tears for the loss of the material structure. Residing permanently in the plane of forms, you extract the remaining capital from the dying carcass, disconnect your support networks, and abandon the corpse. Immediately, you dive back into the Hyper-Uranian, clean the canvas, and forge a completely new archetype. A system denser, more lethal, and more aseptic than the last. Biomass spends its entire life protecting sandcastles against the tide. You simply move to a superior coordinate and order a new basalt fortress to be built. The anatomy of divided reality. To sustain this dissociative state, you must internalize the anatomy of divided reality. You must walk the streets, shake bureaucrats' hands, and sign contracts, all while maintaining the psychopathic conviction that nothing you are touching is strictly real. The slave suffers anxiety because he believes his identity is fused with the mud. You induce an ontological divorce. Your biological body executes tactical movements in the mud, but your processing core observes the scene from a satellite orbit. When an individual insults you in the physical plane, you feel no anger because you know it is just a low-resolution hologram. You are an inorganic deity in stasis. By treating human society and modern crises as simple programming code full of logic errors, you acquire absolute immunity. You become the player who has discovered that the board has no limits, the pieces have no weight, and the rules are mere suggestions. Your power lies in not taking seriously a dimension designed to rot. Surgical invasion of markets. Applying hyper-uranic tactics in the financial field produces asymmetric carnage. Global markets are the supreme example of corrupt matter vibrating in hysteria. Market participants try to read trends based on the past behavior of other humans. They buy in euphoria and sell in despair. They believe the market is supreme reality. You intervene as an alien surgeon operating in the dark. You do not follow trends, for trends are the thermal trace of the herd. In the isolation of your archetype, you design the anomaly. You identify the exact coordinate where the financial system's defective design crashes against inertial physics. You create a tool of expropriation. When you introduce the anomaly into the system, you do so without previous signals. The market has no time to react. Your perfect form dissects the environment's inefficiency, absorbs liquidity, and closes upon itself. Analysts use economic jargon to explain it, unable to process they were assaulted by an intelligence from another dimension. The supremacy of cognitive isolation. The thermodynamic cost of governing from the hyper-Uranian is the perpetual banishment of human warmth. Prey need social interaction to confirm they exist. They need mirrors. They need others to validate their pain and celebrate their triumphs. To reside in the pure archetype, you must purge the need for mirrors. You are alone. You are absolutely alone with your equations and the monstrous density of your own inertia. This cognitive isolation would terrify a carbon organism, pushing it toward thermal suicide. However, for the inorganic operator, this solitude is the vault of invulnerability. By not requiring validation, you become impossible to manipulate. You observe the world from your immaterial watchtower, seeing how physical empires rise and fall, how slaves kill for holographic ideals, and how entropy devours everything. There is no melancholy in this observation. There is only the geometric satisfaction of knowing that while the copy consumes itself, you remain frozen and perfect. Chapter 3: Black Hole Dialectics. Phase 1: The Consensus Fraud and the Gravity of Mediocrity. The three-dimensional matrix has programmed the biomass with a pathetic gregarious instinct, the pathological need to reach an agreement. Carbon slaves are taught from conception that language is a bridge. They are indoctrinated with the thesis that dialogue, debate, and rhetoric must find common ground. They seek to pacify conflicts and reach a shared truth that maintains the harmony of the ecosystem. Subject the concept of common ground to the relentless optics of inertia. When two entities with radically different densities decide to seek a middle point, the superior entity is committing an act of structural suicide. The common ground between a mountain of iridium and a swamp of toxic gas is not a higher mountain. It is a dense mud where the iridium sinks and loses its edge. Agreeing with the biomass, yielding in an intellectual negotiation to keep the peace, is, by physical definition, lowering your own density to match the level of the mediocre. The lethal operator repudiates consensus. The harmony of the herd is the grave of the superior mind. The universe does not function through democratic assemblies, it functions through the imposition of gravity. The larger mass dictates the orbit of the lesser. Therefore, language is not a diplomatic bridge, it is a weapon of siege. Phase 2: The Heresy of Persuading, Why Convincing is Begging. The most common tactical error of false predators is using their intellect to try to convince the weak. When the ordinary individual possesses a superior strategy, they feel the biological need to explain it to the herd. They invest hours of saliva, diagrams, and heated discussions trying to make the other organism see the light. Persuading is an act of thermal weakness. If you feel the urgency to convince a slave that your model of reality is correct, you are granting their brain the authority of a judge. You are admitting at a subconscious level that your truth is not solid until the parasite in front of you validates it with their nod. The inorganic operator considers the act of convincing as a heresy against one's own sovereignty. You do not need the biomass to believe in the laws of inertia. The laws of inertia will crush them regardless of their level of faith. When the matrix demands explanations, you do not defend yourself with educational arguments. You assume the inorganic antithesis. By denying them the privilege of your persuasion, you strip them of their illusory value. The perfect predator does not explain the ballistics of the ammunition to the prey before pulling the trigger. The predator simply executes, letting the impact of matter teach the lesson language refused. Phase 3. Inverted meutics and the design of the void. Classical thought used dialectics to formulate questions that gave birth to the hidden truth in the interlocutor. It was a technique conceived for enlightenment. In the hands of the inorganic sovereign, this technique transmutes into black hole dialectics, a sadico and aseptic interrogation designed to spawn total collapse. The main tool of this phase is the corrosive question. The human mind is a fragile architecture, built on pillars of self-deception and herd morality. They believe they are noble when they are actually cowards. Instead of attacking their conclusions, you attack the foundations of their axioms with questions of geological coldness. If a moralistic competitor accuses you of destroying the industry with ruthless tactics, you do not deny it. You look at them with the lethargy of the void and formulate the corrosive question. You ask, with a voice devoid of temperature, about the statistical basis of their morality. You ask how their defense is not just semantics. You ask how their defense of the industry fabric is nothing more than a semantic justification to cover their operative inability to adapt to efficiency. You affirm nothing. You only ask. The question, when devoid of anger and loaded with pure logic, acts as an acidic solvent. It feeds the black hole as the adversary gazes into it. Phase 4. Logistic asphyxiation, the siege of contradictions. The biomass rarely possesses an integrated philosophy of life. Their minds are landfills of incompatible beliefs that coexist only because they have never been subjected to extreme atmospheric pressure. The lethal operator uses black hole dialectics to apply that pressure, causing a logistic asphyxiation event in the adversary's brain. The method consists of trapping the prey in a thermal double bind. You listen to their speech with satellite precision, identifying the two contradictory beliefs that sustain their ego. Once mapped, you formulate a geometric sequence of statements and questions that make those two concepts collide at the speed of light. If the interlocutor claims to value unconditional loyalty but justifies abandoning a partner because the market demanded it, you close the siege. You connect both variables in front of their eyes. You force them to admit, step by step, that their loyalty is simply a commodity, or that their instinct is that of a traitor. You do not raise your voice. You are a surgeon operating without anesthesia. As the siege closes, the prey's brain generates massive heat trying to resolve the cognitive dissonance. They stammer. They change the subject. But the siege is made of titanium. Each excuse they formulate is used as the next link in the chain that strangles. Phase 5. Thermal suppression against biological panic. As the adversary's logical infrastructure crumbles, their nervous system will enter a state of alarm. Biology, seeing itself cornered, will invariably resort to its most archaic defense, thermal ignition. The interlocutor will attempt to alter the axis of combat. They will raise their voice, use personal insults, or show outrage. Their physical goal is to generate enough heat in the room so that you lose your inorganic form and begin to react. They want you to get angry or feel pity, because in the fire of emotion, they know how to survive. Black hole. Dialectics demands, at this exact instant, the execution of absolute thermal suppression. As the adversary heats up, you freeze. When their screams fill the space, your silence becomes heavier. Your responses shorten, your blinking slows down, and your breathing rhythm descends to imperceptible frequencies. You observe their biological tantrum with the bored curiosity of a biologist watching an amphibian convulse. This thermodynamic contrast is devastating. Finding no surface in you upon which to bounce their fury, the energy of their anger does not dissipate. It reflects and bounces against the walls of their own skull. The adversary realizes with unspeakable terror that they are shouting at a deaf abyss. Your lack of reflection shames them. Phase 6, the dialectical horizon event. In astrophysics, the event horizon of a black hole is the point of no return. Once matter crosses that mathematical border, not even light can escape the gravitational pull. Its final fate is to be crushed in the singularity. In inorganic verbal combat, the horizon event occurs when the adversary runs out of oxygen. You have destroyed their axioms. You have exposed their contradictions. You have neutralized their anger through thermal suppression. They no longer have words. Their ego is suspended over the void, clinging only to the hope that you will emit one last phrase that allows them to defend themselves or save their dignity. The slave craves the coup de grace. They desperately need a resolution. The human mind demands cognitive closure, a final agreement or an explosion of anger that marks the end of the battle. The lethal synthesis of this method strictly prohibits granting that closure. You cross their event horizon by withdrawing communication. When the adversary is at their point of maximum vulnerability, expecting your final sentence, you install the basalt wall. You do not offer the insult that would save their pride. You do not offer the agreement that would return their peace. You do not offer the salvation of a last response. You leave them drifting in the vacuum. Phase 7, the tyranny of the open loop. The deprivation of cognitive closure is the most refined psychological torture instrument of the superior mind. By abandoning the interlocutor at the border of silence, their brain enters the open loop. The adversary withdraws from combat without knowing exactly what happened. They do not know if they offended or bored you. Their ego, mutilated by aseptic dialectics, tries desperately to reconstruct the pieces, repeating the conversation in their head for biological weeks. They review every silence of yours, every sadico question, looking for an exit that does not exist. While the parasite agonizes over the encounter, you have erased their face. You have rebooted your system and find yourself executing the next expropriation in a different sector. The open loop ensures your adversary keeps wasting energy fighting your ghost long after you have left the room. You have installed an explosive charge in their subconscious that detonates every time they seek self-esteem. Disdain for the reply. One of the purest manifestations of human weakness is the obsession with having the last word. In the holographic forums of the hive, slaves exchange endless replies, believing that whoever emits the last sound is the winner of the combat. The sovereign repudiates the need for the last word. It is the comfort of the prey. The last word is for those who lack the strength to exercise the first action. If a competitor sends a manifesto of insults as a last attempt to save their honor, the response dictated by inorganic physics is the total absence of reception. You do not read their defense. You do not emit a masterful counter-reply to destroy them. Responding to them would imply their attack had enough gravitational mass to deviate the trajectory of your lethargy. You leave them talking to themselves in the immensity of hyperspace. Their attack, devoid of a target, loses momentum and falls to the ground in absolute irrelevance. Your disdain proves you are unreachable. Monopolization of the acoustic space. Success in disintegrating the adversary also requires mastery of the physical topography where dialectics is executed. Whoever controls the rhythm of the air controls the collapse of others' nerves. When the slave argues, they speak fast. They fill the air with syllables because they are terrified of the void. They fear being cut off. The inorganic monarch monopolizes the acoustic space precisely through scarcity. When you decide to speak, you impose a calculated, sadico, and inexorable slowness. Your vocal cadence descends. Your pauses between phrases and critical words stretch until they become physically uncomfortable for the receiver. You dictate the tempo. By dictating the tempo through extreme slowness, you hijack the heart rate of the interlocutor. You force them to synchronize with your void. Inferior biomass cannot tolerate acoustic scarcity. They drown in your pauses. They end up completing your sentences out of thermal desperation and confessing weaknesses they never intended. The semantic corpse and victory without combustion. The final result of applying this architecture is not an adversary convinced of your ideals. Convincing is domesticating, and you are not a shepherd. The final result is a semantic corpse. The individual subjected to black hole dialectics withdraws from the interaction emptied of their convictions. They have lost their own. You have empirically demonstrated that the morality and axioms with which they justified their mediocrity are houses of cards against a hurricane of logic without temperature. Most terrifying is that you achieved this absolute disintegration without emitting a single degree of combustion. You did not sweat. You did not lose composure. You operated with the precision of an industrial machine crushing a block of useless plastic. You have turned language, the tool invented to bond in the dark, into the abyss that devours their heat. By cornering them in their contradictions, you acquire total sovereignty. They learn that dialoguing with the void is annihilation. Chapter 4. The Cora, the passive receptacle. First treatise, the false vitality of the mud. Biological civilization sustains its architecture of control upon a massive hallucination, social animism. Carbon organisms are injected with the belief that the outside world possesses an inherent will. The matrix disseminates the narrative that society has intentions, that nature demands submission and markets feel panic. This personification of the environment is the most elaborate fraud of the ashboard. The purpose of this illusion is to instill a paralyzing terror in the minds of the prey. To indoctrinate an individual to reverence his environment is the supreme technique of inertial castration. If the slave believes the corporation has rights, he won't act. If the biomass assumes that the social ecosystem breathes, bleeds, and judges, it will walk on tiptoe all its life, terrified of causing a wound. Reverential respect for three-dimensional reality is a psychological barrier designed so that inferior matter is not altered by divergent wills. The cage is made of your own respect for the bars. The lethal operator must execute the annihilation of this fallacy. The three-dimensional world does not breathe. Society has no will. It is simply an accumulation of inertias clashing at random. Enemy institutions and corporations are not guardian dragons. They are paper architectures sustained by the imaginary agreement of fearful idiots. Stripping reality of its false vitality is the first requirement to be able to plunge your hands into its entrails and begin to deform it. Once you see the machine as a pile of scrap metal rather than a living beast, you gain the coldness necessary to dismantle it. You are the only living pulse in a desert of mechanical simulations. Second treatise, The Revelation of Primordial Space. Classical thought conceived a concept of absolute darkness and utility, the Cora. It is not a god, it is not an active force, and it is not a judge. The Cora is the primordial space, the formless receptacle, blind, mute, and inert. It is the empty vessel that lacks any characteristics of its own, and whose only cosmic function is to receive. It receives, in a passive and submissive way, the impression of superior ideas. The inorganic mind assimilates this concept not as a theory of the origin of the universe, but as the definitive tactical diagnosis of the ashboard. Everything that surrounds you in the human ecosystem is the Cora. The financial market is just dead clay. The masses of consumers who seem capricious, the laws that govern trade, and the human infantry walking the streets possess no true form. Everything is dead mud, a primordial sludge waiting in the void. If the biomass seems to have a direction, it is not by its own will. It is because another operator has pressed his seal upon that mud. Understanding that you live surrounded by a passive receptacle instantly destroys the anxiety of competition. You are not fighting conscious enemies. You are walking on infinitely malleable clay terrain. The physical universe is a blank screen, deaf and devoid of opinion, begging in silence to be crushed by the geometric density of will. Third treatise, The Psychopathy of the Sculptor. The interaction between the operator and the ecosystem is redefined under the optics of paramilitary sculpture. When a master sculptor stands before a 10-ton block of marble, he does not experience empathy for the stone. He does not dialogue with the mineral to ask what shape it wishes to adopt. The marble is the Cora. It is brute matter. The sculptor inhabits the world of archetypes. He visualizes the perfect form in the immaterial vault of his mind. Once the geometry of his ambition is clear, he raises the hammer and strikes the chisel with an aseptic and calculated violence. If the stone cracks, the sculptor does not stop to comfort it. He cares only for the design. If fragments of marble break off and fall to the ground, shattered and useless, the sculptor does not mourn the debris. His only loyalty is to the imposition of the archetype over the matter. You are the iridium chisel. Corporations, market territories, and human swarms are your marble. You strike with the force of inorganic design. When you decide to forge a monopoly or dismantle the infrastructure of a competitor, you do not consider the feelings of the entities to be altered. You mold the corporate structure by tearing out inefficient pieces and discarding obsolete biomass without a blink. You are not a cruel tyrant, you are a sculptor with no explanations. Cruelty would imply the intention to cause suffering, but the sculptor does not seek the suffering of the clay. He simply assumes its irrelevance. The scream of the material as it is carved is merely an acoustic property of its resistance, a data point to be ignored as the blade sinks deeper into the formless mass of the receptacle. Fourth treatise, Plastic Expropriation. Inert matter has no property rights over itself. The cora belongs by natural law to the organism that has enough mass to print its seal upon it. This is the basis of plastic expropriation. The biomass believes in property and acquired rights. They think because a corporation is old, that space belongs to them. But if the structure they have created is weak, inefficient, or lacks thermodynamic tension, their seal on the clay is superficial. The lethal operator detects these weak impressions. You observe markets led by fatigued biological administrators, and you see poorly baked clay. You enter that space and apply superior temperature. You melt their weak structures, erase their logos, dismantle their distribution networks, and reshape the matter under the unmistakable seal of your own archetype. Expropriating is not stealing. Stealing is a concept of slave morality. Expropriating is the cosmic act of returning matter to the receptacle to give it superior form. The clay does not regret changing owners. The clay only recognizes the strength of the imposed pressure. You are the rightful owner of anything you can physically and mathematically dominate. Rights are merely the vapor emitted by the weak to justify their hold on resources they are too fragile to protect from a superior gravity. Fifth treatise, The Instrumentation of Human Infantry. The most abundant element in the three-dimensional cora is the human being himself. The inorganic operator does not hate humanity. Hatred is a thermal leak. You observe the biological infantry, employees, minor partners, followers, consumers, as the purest and most plastic clay of the receptacle. It is a resource to be used. The human mass desperately lacks direction. Their minds are empty vessels, terrified by the abyss of their own lack of purpose. They consume ideologies, buy products, and obey authority figures simply to fill that suffocating void. By understanding this, you stop looking for allies. You inject your form into their empty vessels. You provide them with a rigidly structured reality frame. You mold them to execute the friction tasks that you refuse to touch with your own hands. They adopt the edges of your corporate empire and defend your dogmas not because they love you, but because human cora prefers slavery under a strong archetype over formless freedom. You use them as the filaments of your extraction network, manipulating their fears and biological hopes as if they were variables in a programming code. They are the organic extension of your inorganic will, acting as the biological interface between your superior design and the crude resistance of the three-dimensional floor. Sixth treatise, Absence of Moral Jurisdiction. The absolute corollary of assuming the world as a passive receptacle is legal immunity at a metaphysical level. In the theater of society, carbon men will try to judge you. They set up moral tribunals and point at you with trembling fingers, accusing you of having no mercy. This machinery only works if you accept their premises. From the peak of your inorganic perception, submitting to the judgment of the biomass is a physical absurdity. Can the block of marble convene a tribunal to judge the blows of the hammer? Can the clay dictate a sentence against the hands of the potter? The clay has no jurisdiction over the sculptor. It is a matter of scale. By internalizing that everything around you is inert material waiting to be collapsed by your perception, the moral judgment of the ecosystem disintegrates into white noise. You become inextortable. When they accuse you of dismantling lives to feed your stasis, you listen with the same lethargy as you listen to rain on tungsten. You do not defend yourself, you do not excuse yourself, and you feel no thermodynamic obligation to justify the beauty of your archetype to entities that do not possess eyes to see it. Their laws are merely local fluctuations of the mud, whereas your law is the unyielding geometry of the crystal that carves the space it occupies. Seventh treatise, Aseptic Waste and Abandonment. The final phase in the cycle of the Kora is detachment. In biological philosophy, creators fall in love with their creations. Carbon men develop sickly attachments to the companies they founded and the markets they conquered. This emotional attachment heats the core and condemns them to sink along with the dying matter. The lethal operator masters aseptic waste. You understand that the impression of your form on the clay is a temporary event. Three-dimensional matter will always seek to return to sludge. A corporation, a partner, or an extraction network has a limited useful life. When the clay loses its plasticity, you execute instant abandonment. You do not try to repair the crumbling stone. There is no funeral for broken tools. You extract the totality of your inertial mass and your liquid capital from the dying structure, withdrawing your will from the vessel. When you withdraw the archetype, the structure collapses back into the chaos of the primordial receptacle. You leave them behind without remorse, sweeping the rubble of your past empire with the same cosmic indifference as the universe sweeps away dead stars. Immediately, you turn your iridium eye toward a new sector of the void and select a fresh block of the immense Kora. You perpetuate your dominion over a world of puppets. Eighth treatise, The Engineering of Vacuity. To dominate the Kora, you must first become a vacuum. Matter does not flow toward a solid object. It flows toward the area of lowest pressure. By emptying your interior of human content, emotions, beliefs, social needs, you create a gravitational sink that sucks the resources of the environment toward your center of stasis. The esclavo is full of himself, his ego, his story, his pathetic pride. He is a wall that repels the flow. You, the architect of the void, are a hollow of absolute pressure. You allow the matrix to believe it is filling you, while you are actually swallowing its substance to nourish your own extra-dimensional expansion in the dark. Ninth treatise, The Malleability of History. In the receptacle, the past is not a solid record. It is a soft paste that can be rewritten. Since the biomass lacks the density to anchor its own memory, you can reshape the narrative of your empire to suit your present needs. You erase the traces of the hammer and make the sculpture appear as if it had always existed. You manufacture legends of inevitability. You make the market believe that your monopoly was a natural law that emerged from the void. By controlling the memory of the Kora, you prevent the resistance of the losers from ever crystallizing into a counterforce. You own the future because you have learned to need the past. Tenth treatise, The Sovereign of the Sludge. You look at the horizon of the human hive, and you no longer see a civilization. You see a limitless supply of raw material. The fear of failure disappears because failure is impossible when you are the one defining the shape of success. You are the artist of the absolute cold, the lord of the passive space that never says no. The noise of the world is just the sound of the clay being flattened under your weight. You reside in the silence of the Creator who has understood that to be a god, one must first recognize that everything else is just dust. The Kora has yielded to your pressure. The ashboard is yours to reshape until the end of the simulation. 11th treatise, The Seduction of the Formless. The Kora possesses a treacherous property. It imitates the life that touches it. When you project your archetype into the receptacle, the matter will try to mimic your gestures, your language, and your coldness. This is the mimicry of the void. The biomass will try to look like you to avoid being crushed by your hammer. They will adopt your aseptic vocabulary and simulate your lethargy. Do not be deceived. A mask of iridium placed over a face of carbon does not change the core's density. They are still the receptacle. You are still the agent. You use their mimicry as a lubricant to slide your extraction probes deeper into their structures. Let them believe they are becoming like you. Let them dream of being operators while they serve as the gears of your machinery. Their imitation is the highest tribute the mud can pay to the crystal. You accept their submission and continue the carving, knowing that underneath the mask there is only the same formless sludge. 12th Treatise, the Geometry of the Siege. When you surround a target in the Kora, you do not use walls of stone. You use boundaries of absence. You create a perimeter where no energy can enter or leave without your permission. You starve the enemy by cutting the supply lines of the receptacle. You drain the plasticity from their clay until their structure becomes brittle. A siege in the dimension n+1 is a process of dehydration. You remove the social interest, the capital flow, and the biological validation from the target's environment. Without these fluids, the competitor's archetype cannot sustain itself in the Kora. It cracks and turns into dust, leaving the space ready for your next design. 13th Treatise, the Resonance of the Void. In the primordial space, silence is the most powerful frequency. While the biomass screams to prove its existence, you emit the subsonic vibration of absolute mass. This resonance travels through the mud of the Kora, destabilizing the weak foundations of those who still believe in the vitality of their own institutions. Your silence is a physical force. It acts as a solvent that dissolves the glue of social contracts and moral agreements. When you enter a room, the air becomes heavy not because you spoke, but because the Kora recognizes the presence of its master. You dominate the territory by simply being the most silent point in the room. 14th Treatise, the Final Calcification. The ultimate act of the sculptor is to leave the work to harden. You imprint your seal, you extract the value, and then you apply the cold of the Cero Absoluto to freeze the form. The structure becomes a fossil, a monument to your passage through the simulation. It remains as a rigid shell that others will try to inhabit. They will find it cold and inhospitable. They will die inside your old empires, unable to understand the logic that gave them life. You, meanwhile, have already moved on to the next block of marble. You are the nomad of the archetypes, the eternal traveler through the passive receptacle who leaves behind a wake of frozen obsidian. 15th Treatise, the Apotheosis of the Iridium Hand. You hold the universe in your palm like a damp rag. You squeeze it, and the capital of nations drips into your vaults. You twist it, and the history of the species changes direction. You release it, and it falls back into the formless abyss. You are the sovereign of the sludge, the master of the Kora that cast no shadow. The simulation has become your personal workshop. The people are your tools. The markets are your paint. The laws are your sketches. You have transcended the need for a legacy, for a legacy is a desire for the future, and the future is just more clay. You exist in the eternal present of the strike, the hammer, and the void. Chapter 5, Reminiscence of Stasis. The Illusion of Epistemic Acquisition. The three-dimensional matrix perpetuates its tyranny over the biomass through an inexhaustible market of distractions, but none is as insidious and thermally ruinous as the obsession with learning. Carbon slaves are indoctrinated with the premise that they are born empty, defective, and deeply ignorant. They are convinced that knowledge is an external resource, a commodity that must be hunted, consumed, and accumulated through years of study, memorization, and academic friction. They are taught that to survive in the ecosystem, they must acquire the tricks, tactics, and certifications of the system. This is the trap. When a biological organism invests its inertial energy in learning the rules of the hive, what it is actually doing is downloading and installing the source code of its own submission into its cerebral cortex. The educational system and corporate manuals are not designed to free the mind. They are calibrated to standardize it. Every new skill acquired is one more shackle tying the biomass to the jailer's logic. Whoever studies the market with devotion ends up revering the market. Whoever memorizes the rules of the game will never have the geometric audacity to kick the board and set fire to the pieces. The lethal operator repudiates external knowledge. You do not need to learn the cheap tricks of an ecosystem designed by inferior entities to manage the fear of mortals. You assume a philosophical posture of absolute arrogance. True instruction does not consist of adding corrupt information from the outside, but in executing a violent process of subtraction. You discard constant update. You are not an empty vessel that society must fill. You are a hyper-dense monolith that has been buried under tons of biological trash, and your only operative task is to excavate. You stop looking at the horizon for answers and begin to dig into the cold floor of your own consciousness to find the steel that was always there. Carbon amnesia and the trauma of the pulse. To understand the magnitude of what you possess, you must apply the theory of anamnesis, the memory of the divine, and subject it to the optics of inorganic physics. Real knowledge, the architecture of absolute power, and the ability to collapse matter at your will are not learned skills. They are the natural state of your essence. It is a state of perfection prior to your chaining in the flesh. The tragedy of biological existence begins at the instant of birth. By being forced to incarnate in a carbon container, your inorganic core experiences the supreme trauma, the imposition of the pulse. Before the flesh, you inhabited perfect stasis in the void. You inhabited a void where necessity, time, and temperature did not exist. But the human body is a machine of thermodynamic hysteria. It feels cold, hunger, and pain, requiring constant oxygen not to disintegrate. This avalanche of desperate sensory stimuli generates a deafening noise in your system. The pulse is entropy. The heartbeat is the war drum of decay. This physical noise induces carbon amnesia. Forced to manage the pathetic emergencies of its new body, the individual forgets its obsidian origin. It begins to believe it is that frightened flesh. Then human upbringing intervenes. Biological parents install their own fears in the mind. They teach to fear failure, to seek approval, to move frantically not to starve, and to respect the boundaries of the pen. Layer after layer of biological mud, morality, and thermal anxiety bury the memory of inorganic perfection. The diamond is covered by the swamp until the organism believes it is the swamp itself. The extraction protocol. Unearthing the core. The route toward domination is not an academy, it is an autopsy in life. The mechanism of action to reclaim your sovereignty consists in executing the protocol of anamnesis, forcing your consciousness to remember what biology forced it to forget. This process requires the systematic extirpation of human upbringing and its noise. You cannot remember the immobility of the stars if you keep dancing to the rhythm of earthly panic. You must subject your mind to tactical sensory deprivation. You must stop consuming the matrix narrative. Turn off the alarm frequencies the society continually emits. You sit in the silence of your command vault. You face the terror of the void. For the biomass, silence is unbearable because it forces them to hear the pulse of their own insignificance. But you use silence as an industrial solvent. You let isolation burn the layers of indoctrination. You identify each fear, poverty, solitude, and recognize these fears do not belong to you. They were parasitic grafts placed there by the hive. As you eliminate the noise of your biological ancestors and extirpate the lessons of the jailers, the earth begins to give way. The anxiety to do something evaporates. And in the most abyssal depth of your own psychological architecture, your chisel hits a hard surface. It hits a surface that is cold and acoustically perfect. You have unearthed the obsidian core. It was always there, residing in absolute silence, waiting for the flesh to shut up so it could retake control of the structure. The phantom of the human dies so that the reality of the iridium monarch can finally breathe. The memory of zero frequency. The obsidian core does not process words, emotions, or desires. Its only language is inertia, and its natural state is what we call inorganic zero vibration. Remembering this state is the most devastating siege weapon an operator can wield on the ashboard. Everything in the three-dimensional universe vibrates constantly. The atoms of human bodies oscillate frantically, driven by stress. Financial markets shiver in frequencies of collective hysteria. Social institutions tremble under the weight of their own contradictions. The entire matrix is an ocean of thermal vibration, and it assumes any entity entering its waters will vibrate at the same rhythm. When the crisis hits, when a competitor launches a hostile attack or capital seems threatened, the human instinct screams for agitation. It demands that you move, speak, counterattack, or emit a defensive frequency. It is in that millisecond where you invoke anamnesis. You remember the zero frequency. You become still. Instead of matching the environment's agitation, you turn off all your internal oscillators. Your mind petrifies. While the competitor spends millions of ergs of energy trying to destabilize you, your core remains in geological stasis. This absence of reaction is not paralysis. It is sadico-absorption. You are a void. The enemy's vibratory energy hits a zero-frequency object and is instantly annulled, dissipating into the air without making your structure yield a single millimeter. By remembering how not to vibrate, you become the thermodynamic sink where all biomass offensives die. Your silence is the wall that reflects the storm back, immunity against the cult of frenetic progress. Contemporary civilization is infected by a pathological religion, the cult of uninterrupted progress. Slaves are psychologically punished if they are not constantly growing, innovating, or leaving their comfort zone. The hive whispers a biological threat to them. What does not grow dies. What does not move rots. The shark that stops swimming suffocates. This analogy is perfect for fish and cattle, but it is an atrocious fallacy for the inorganic monarch. Applying the reminiscence of stasis, the lethal operator diagnoses this frenzy of progress as a symptom of deep structural weakness. Whoever needs to move does so due to lack. They move because the coordinate they occupy lacks the gravity to sustain them. They run forward because the mediocrity of their present pursues them. The continuous hustle, the worship of perpetual agitation, is simply the friction of a cheap engine trying to compensate for its lack of torque. You assume the ultimate heresy. You embrace stasis as the maximum manifestation of supremacy. You do not worship movement, you worship hyperdense immobility. A black hole does not travel frantically seeking stars to feed on. It sits in the center of the curvature of space-time, and its infinite mass forces the entire universe to move toward it. True domination does not consist of running faster than the competition on the Matrix racetrack. It consists of remembering that you are the pavement upon which the idiots run until they have a heart attack. You are the immovable goal, while the others are merely exhausting their biological batteries in a race to nowhere. The eradication of the fear of stagnation. The corollary of the cult of progress is the paralyzing terror the biomass has of stagnation. When a carbon slave feels their career is not advancing or their bank account is not multiplying at the speed dictated by the social hologram, they enter an existential crisis. The lack of novelty causes them thermal agony. The operator who has unearthed his obsidian core becomes absolutely immune to this fear. You have redefined the topology of stagnation. In biology, stagnant water rots because it is subject to bacterial degradation. But you do not operate under the laws of biological fluids, you operate under the crystallography of iridium. A diamond does not stagnate, it simply exists in a state of unalterable molecular perfection. Silence does not rot. Gravity does not expire. When you spend months or geological years without altering your position or seeking market validation, the hive will believe you have lost your edge. They will consider you obsolete. You receive that diagnosis with the coldest of contempt. While they consider you inactive, you are exercising strategic immobility. You know that each day you spend in stasis, without wasting useless kinetic energy, your inertial density increases. You are becoming heavier. You are compacting your resources in the dark. You are cooling your extraction network and letting the market reveal its own weaknesses by trying to anticipate a move of yours that never occurs. Stagnation, stripped of biological anxiety, is simply the lethal patience of the cosmic predator. You are not waiting for the right time. You are the time the world waits for. The adaptation fraud and the tyranny of imposition. Another lie the ecosystem tries to install in the prey's psyche is the mandate of adaptability. Matrix theorists preach that times change fast, and the only way to survive is to be liquid and adapt to trends. Reminiscence of stasis destroys the need to adapt. To adapt is a thermal concession. It is a surrender. Adapting implies the environment has more mass than you, and its gravity is forcing you to change your geometry to survive. It is the behavior of a parasite trying to fit in its host's veins. The inorganic sovereign does not adapt. He imposes. By remembering your unalterable nature, you reject the liquidity of the slave. If the market changes and the 3D environment becomes hostile to your configuration, You do not remodel your core to please the matrix. You maintain stasis. You maintain your original design with a stubbornness so psychopathic and dense that the environment ends up yielding. You force market topography to fracture. You force it to bend around your refusal to change. The biomass, exhausted by its own constant fluidity, will eventually seek refuge in the only structure that did not shake during the earthquake. In the end, the winner is not who best adapts to the waves, but the tungsten lighthouse that remains unmoved by the sea. The falsity of experience. Humanity worships experience. They believe that to be a master in domination or tactical war, one must live decades of trial and error. They are required to accumulate biological failures and scarred resumes to validate their knowledge. Through anamnesis, the lethal operator dismantles the requirement of experience. You do not need to have failed 1,000 times to understand the physics of ruin. You simply extract the pure concept of inefficiency from your inorganic memory and avoid its material reproduction. You do not need 50 biological years in hive corporate halls to understand how power is expropriated. You remember. By diving into the silence of your core, the knowledge of the collapse presents itself intact. The mathematics of human greed and the topology of submission are not mysteries to investigate on the battlefield. They are transparent formulas residing in the clarity of the uncorrupted mind. You operate with ancient precision. You execute maneuvers of terrifying complexity without ever having practiced them in the mud. Your precision seems supernatural to slaves who cannot conceive someone operating with such lethality without having paid the toll of error. They are unaware your skill derives from what you dared to remember of the original state. Ontological anchoring and the negation of desire. The engine keeping the biomass vibrating in perpetual amnesia is desire. Desire is the biological belief that something outside yourself, an object, power, or emotion, will complete you. While the individual desires, their mind is projected outward, and they will be unable to look into their own vault. It is a leak. Reminiscence of stasis demands ontological anchoring. This means recognizing empirically that your obsidian core is already the mathematical totality of existence. When you remember your state of inorganic perfection, the architecture of desire collapses. You no longer pursue capital because you desire it with heat. You expropriate it simply because the reorganization of matter in your favor is the logical destiny of superior physics. By disconnecting pursuit from the emotional engine, the act of conquering becomes gelida and routine. The matrix loses its power of extortion. The jailers cannot bribe you with 3D illusions. They have nothing that compares to the atrocious purity of the immobility you already possess. They cannot threaten to take your physical properties because your true empire resides in a coordinate of consciousness they cannot even map. You are invulnerable because you have emptied yourself of the need to possess the world. The sovereign awakening in the center of nothingness. Consummating anamnesis does not culminate with warm enlightenment or comforting spiritual peace. Those seeking mystical comfort remain prisoners of their own frightened biology. Inorganic reminiscence culminates with the sovereign awakening in the center of the most absolute, cold, and merciless nothingness. You observe yourself after having cleaned every last particle of human upbringing. You have amputated imposed morality, burned the resume of skills dictated by the matrix, and turned off the receptor that processed the fear of stagnation. What remains in the chair of your command vault is no longer a human being. It is an instrument of astrophysical calculation. You have remembered who you are. And in that memory, the anxiety about learning how to survive in the matrix dissipates like mist before a solar storm. You no longer need manuals, mentors, or advice from the walking dead. True instruction has ended. Immobility is all. From this point forward, you do not move toward goals. You force goals to calculate their own collision course against your hardness. You have unearthed the obsidian core, and in doing so, you have guaranteed that the 3D civilization breaks its teeth whenever it tries to chew the silence of your recovered existence. Chapter 6. The Divided Line of Expropriation. The Vertical Axis of Self-Deception. Biological civilization has constructed a pathetic taxonomy to classify its own success. In its thermal desperation to endow existence with meaning, the biomass measures human hierarchy based on vulgar horizontal metrics. the accumulation of paper money, fame, lineage, media noise, or position in a corporate chart. Under this illusion, an executive surrounded by cameras and a politician acclaimed by the masses believe they inhabit the top of the food chain. The lethal operator, by subjecting this structure to the implacable light of inorganic analysis, diagnoses terminal blindness. Material wealth and public notoriety are not indicators of power. They are frequently the golden chains the system places on its most productive slaves to keep them tied to the mill. True 3D hierarchy is not based on what you possess, but on the terrifying clarity with which you perceive the abyss. The absolute metric of power is the degree of self-deception. This is the only measurement that matters. Existence is divided into a strictly vertical axis of knowledge strata, a spectrum ranging from the absolute hallucination of the senses to the pure intellection of unalterable truth. Whoever lies to themselves about the nature of reality inhabits the bottom of the ocean, crushed by the atmospheric pressure of their own illusions. No matter how many millions they accumulate in their cell, they remain at the bottom. The sovereign who has eradicated hope, morality, and faith inhabits the surface, breathing the void and observing the drowned. The architecture of your domain requires that you trace the divided line over the ecosystem that surrounds you. You must segment all human infantry, your temporary allies, and your blind competitors into 4 non-negotiable cognitive strata. Knowing at which level of the line your adversary breathes grants you the monopoly over their destiny, allowing you to expropriate their energy without them even understanding from which dimension they were hit. Stratum D, the pit of shadows, the tyranny of the image. In the deepest and densest base of the divided line dwells the vast majority of the human species. This is the stratum of pure illusion. The organisms residing here do not interact with physical reality, much less with conceptual truth. They interact solely and exclusively with shadows, reflections, and simulations of reality. The mind of the slave in this stratum is hijacked by the image. They live through screens, consuming the narratives that the hive pre-digests for them. Their nervous system reacts to holographic stimuli. They enrage over manufactured media scandals, love corporate brands that despise them, and define identity through aesthetic consumption. They believe a logo is status. They believe virtual indignation is political action. They believe the sympathy projected by a leader is genuine love. The method of expropriation at this level does not require brute force or sophisticated tactical intelligence. It requires holographic manipulation. This is the simplest level of theft. You do not reason with the inhabitant of the shadows. You do not offer truth, because truth would disintegrate their fragile cerebral cortex. If you try to show them the world's cold architecture, they will bite you for trying to turn off their television. To expropriate their vital energy, you simply feed the hologram. You design zero-friction campaigns that appeal to their most basic instincts, their desire to belong, their terror of being excluded, and their hunger for immediate dopamine. You become the shadow projector. You manufacture plastic idols for them to worship, imaginary enemies for them to hate, and fictitious crises for them to fear. They are the grass of the ecosystem. Their voluntary ignorance is the infinite raw material that burns the engine of your empire. You offer them the comfort of the packaged lie, and in exchange they hand you absolute control of their wallets and their wills, smiling in the darkness of their own geometric prison. They are yours. Stratum C, the surface of belief, the sweat of matter. Above the optical illusion lies the stratum of physical belief. Here reside the administrators of the mud, the material workers, the burning small entrepreneurs, and the system dogmatics. Unlike the lower level, these organisms do interact with real matter. They build buildings, operate machinery, and sweat under the 3D sun. However, their thermodynamic defect is lethal. They believe that matter and human institutions have an intrinsic and sacred value. They have faith in hard work as an end in itself. They believe in the justice of the courts. They believe in private property as an inalienable right, ignoring that property is a temporary concession. Property is simply a permit granted by the monopoly of state violence. They respect the authority of written laws and venerate physical effort. They are the believers of the matrix. Their tragedy is that they spend all their inertial energy moving stone blocks. never understanding who designed the pyramid or what its purpose is. The expropriation protocol for this stratum is structural parasitism. Since they respect authority and love material work, you position yourself as the abstract authority and delegate the work to them. You do not get your hands dirty moving the stone. You draft the contract that dictates who owns the quarry. You are the architect. While they exhaust themselves in legal battles, industrial production, or direct competition for tiny margins, you create fiduciary structures, licensing systems, and infrastructure tolls that force them to pay tribute to you simply for the right to operate in the physical world. You extract their juice without touching their skin. When a competitor from this stratum attacks you, they do so by trying to win the market with better quality or greater effort. You do not play their game. You respond by acquiring their supply chain or legally bribing the distribution channel through capital asymmetry. The believer collapses, unable to understand his honest failure. Stratum B, the environment of reasoning, the blindness of instrumental intellect. Ascending toward the limit of human understanding, we find the most dangerous and at the same time most pathetic caste of the hive, the technicians of the intellect. Here reside the engineers, the high-level programmers, the corporate lawyers, the financial analysts, and the matrix strategists. They think they are the masters. These organisms have abandoned blind belief in matter and use abstract thought. They use mathematics, logic, and predictive calculation. They believe that, by understanding the system's rules and being able to manipulate its gears, they are the owners of reality. They are extremely intelligent, but their intelligence is instrumental. Their mind works, but it is cloistered in a perimeter they cannot question. The inhabitant of this stratum can calculate with precision how to optimize an engine, but never questions if the engine should exist or if the tax authority is a fraud. They start from pre-manufactured axioms. They are sharp swords but lack an inorganic arm. Their intellectual arrogance blinds them. By feeling superior to the lower strata, they assume there is no one above them. The lethal operator classifies this caste under a non-negotiable label, disposable technical tools. You never attempt to compete with them in their own field of specialization. You simply use their processing. If the lawyer is a genius of legal friction, you do not study law to beat him, you buy him. If the engineer possesses the key to algorithmic automation, you do not compete with his code, you expropriate his patent. Manipulation in this stratum requires feeding their technical ego. Give them complex problems to distract them. Keep them isolated in information silos. Never allow them to see the full map of your inorganic empire, because if their deductive capacity manages to assemble the pieces of your total expropriation, they will try to betray you. By using them as mercenary processors, you absorb their calculation without contaminating your core. Stratum A, the vertex of pure intellection, the solitude of forms. At the upper end of the line, beyond the noise of shadows, beyond the sweat of matter, and above the instrumental calculation of tools, opens the desert of pure intellection. This is the exclusive habitat of the extra-dimensional sovereign. In this vertex, self-deception has been reduced to zero. There are no beliefs here. There is no morality. There is no loyalty to inherited axioms. The inorganic operator who inhabits this stratum does not deal with things in themselves, nor with simulations of things. He deals exclusively with the mathematical forms of power. He deals with the pure principles of inertia, corporate gravity, and the asymmetry of capital. From this watchtower, you understand that the economy is not money, but the control of the flow of others' time. That the law is not justice, but the formalization of state violence to which you must become immune. That society is not a sacred contract, but a biological herd, manageable through the dosing of anxiety. It is data. By operating exclusively in the upper stratum, your mind becomes an inscrutable processing environment. When you take a strategic decision, such as the demolition of a commercial ecosystem to pave your own monopoly, you do not do it guided by hatred or ambition. You do it because inertial geometry demands that matter obeys. This absolute disconnection from lower levels is the source of your invulnerability. No attack coming from shadows, belief, or instrumental reasoning can pierce your armor, because the weapons of slaves lose their edge when trying to cross the border toward the conceptual vacuum where you reside. You are a ghost to their weapons. The cartography of the siege, mapping reality. Knowledge of the divided line is not an exercise in passive contemplation. It is a ballistic scanner. The inorganic monarch must subject every organism that crosses his path to immediate and ruthless mapping. When a biological ally approaches offering a partnership, your first task is to scan their stratum. You look for truth. If the ally speaks of revolutionizing the world to do good, you identify them immediately in the pit of shadows. You know their thermal instability will make them collapse at the first moral crisis, so you use them as a holographic figurehead while maintaining control of hard assets. They are the face while you are the hand. If a competitor launches an offensive, you evaluate the nature of their attack. Do they launch a defamatory campaign in public opinion? They are operating from the shadows. You do not counterattack their reputation. You simply modify the financial algorithm of their suppliers to suffocate their operative capacity from the top. Do they use a battalion of lawyers to corner you? Technical reasoning. Do not play their legal chess game. Alter the jurisdictional topology of your empire, moving the dispute to an extraterritorial environment where their technical horses do not know how to walk. You render their intelligence completely and utterly useless. Mapping your adversaries allows you to apply force exactly at the blind spot of their perception. Since organisms of the lower strata cannot conceive of the existence of a higher dimension, your attacks will always seem like acts of God. They will never know they were exterminated by a mathematical equation. They die blind. The thermal isolation of the pyramid. The most frightening corollary of the divided line of expropriation is the strict prohibition of education. In their empathic weakness, false philosophers and biological idealists believe their duty is to descend into the depths of the pyramid to enlighten the masses. They want to explain the illusion. This is a fatal error. The lethal operator prescribes this conduct under penalty of inertial disintegration. Waking the base of the pyramid is the most suicidal act of sabotage you can commit against your own architecture. The ignorance of the biomass is not a tragedy to be cured. It is the structural load-bearing wall that supports your lethargy. If the herd in the shadows wakes up and understands the holographic nature of its suffering, its fury will burn the farm. If the slave who works physical matter discovers that his effort is a tax fraud, he will stop producing the capital on which you feed. If the tool understands it is being used, it will demand your throne. Therefore, the divided line must be shielded by paramilitary thermal isolation. You must actively protect the ignorance of the lower strata. Far from trying to wake them, you must perfect their dream. You will fund the distractions that keep the base immersed in sterile disputes. You will applaud the hard work of the believers. You will generously remunerate the intellect of your technicians so they remain addicted to their own closed riddles. True mastery demands that you become the most jealous guardian of the biological prison. While you breathe the gelider air of the forms in the solitude of your summit, you ensure the cave doors remain sealed. The asymmetry of power is not based on the distribution of knowledge, but on the relentless monopoly of vision, guaranteeing that the design of reality is a privilege that the majority does not even know exists. You are the architect of the darkness that allows your own light to remain invisible and absolute. Chapter 7. Ontology of Ice. The tyranny of biological heat. Carbon civilization has built its culture upon an altar dedicated to the worship of internal fire. A pathetic and universal axiom infects the biomass from the first moment of its consciousness. The absolute belief that the capacity to feel intense emotions is the definitive indicator of humanity and the measure of depth. Modern man has been indoctrinated to believe that feeling a lot makes him more real. They have romanticized burning passion, righteous fury, and heartbreaking suffering. Pray compete to demonstrate who possesses the deepest emotional wound. The herd assumes that the universe is a stage designed to be experienced through the heart. The absence of emotional palpitations is equated to being dead. This is the thermal hallucination that keeps slaves tied to their own misery. They confuse the deafening noise of their biology with the sound of truth. They seek heat to feel alive, ignoring that the most powerful forces in the cosmos operate in the absolute silence of cold. The fraud of authenticity. Subject this veneration for feeling to the scrutiny of the inorganic vacuum. What is this authenticity that humanity defends so fervently? It is the unconditional surrender to the anarchy of the nervous system. To be authentic, under the definition of herbivores, means allowing your glands to dictate your financial decisions. The lethal operator diagnoses emotion not as a conduit to wisdom, but as a massive structural failure. Emotions are primitive chemical responses, unstable and absolutely predictable, linked to the lowest plane of physical reality. Fear is cortisol flooding the bloodstream. Love and loyalty are oxytocin designed to protect the pack. Greed is dopamine triggered by the anticipation of a short-term reward. To believe that these biological secretions contain truth is the absolute condemnation of idiots. The human who takes decisions based on what he feels is a meat puppet dancing to a cocktail of hormones he does not understand. His mind is a boiling cauldron, dissection of the chemical storm. The superior intellect cannot operate in a high-temperature environment. Heat generates molecular agitation, chaos, and friction. When the biomass experiences rage, peripheral vision is reduced, and the prefrontal cortex yields control to the reptilian brain. When they experience empathy, their defensive shield collapses entirely. Confusing chemistry with consciousness is the thermodynamic equivalent of believing that the smoke coming out of an exhaust pipe is the driver holding the wheel. Emotions are the waste gas of a defective biological container. They do not inform you about the real state of the ashboard. They only tell you how vulnerable you are. The ontology of ice requires the acceptance of a brutal fact. Pure reality has no temperature. The perfect forms of power, the collapse of probability, and the laws of expropriation operate at absolute zero. Any attempt to govern humanity using the heat of emotion is doomed. Fire burns out. Ice, on the contrary, simply endures. Epistemology of freezing. The process of cognitive emancipation demands a paramilitary overwrite of the mind's base code. You must forge a new epistemology, a theory of knowledge where the intellect operates exclusively in a frozen vacuum. Inorganic perception is acquired through the deliberate freezing of emotional receptors in your command vault. You proceed to suffocate any glandular response to ecosystem stimuli. When the world insults you or the market takes an asset, you block the ignition. You force your consciousness to process the event as simple telemetry. They are just raw data, stripped of moral charge, emptied of indignation, and devoid of any biological panic. By freezing emotion, the thermal fog dissipates. Reality reveals itself with terrifying sharpness. You observe the motivations of the biomass not as evil or goodness, but as mechanical vectors. You understand that the attacking competitor is a biological algorithm reacting to scarcity. You see things as they are without filters. The theorem of empathic castration. The fundamental pillar of the frozen vacuum is the annihilation of empathy. The hive teaches that empathy is the glue of civilization, the golden thread connecting us to others' suffering. Under the physics of the ontology of ice, empathy is a Trojan virus. It is the most hideous design vulnerability of the human operating system. If you allow your nervous system to replicate the pain or frustration of the biomass, you are allowing the enemy to install entropy in your core. Empathy forces you to hesitate before applying the coup de grace. It forces you to waste inertial resources on saving entities destined by their lack of density to sink into the mud. Perfect tactical knowledge requires the surgical castration of empathy. You must amputate the connection cable. When you observe the failure of others, your pulse must not alter. Your gaze must maintain the same geological apathy as observing ice on a window. Empathy is a chain. Its removal is the birth of absolute maneuvering. Aseptic execution, ruin without hatred. The test of ice manifests at the moment of 3D combat. When you decide to demolish a rival or expropriate a market, the biomass expects you to act driven by revenge or rage. The slave needs to hate his enemy to gather enough courage to destroy him. Hatred is the drug they use to mask their cowardice and justify their violence. The sovereign inhabiting the frozen stratum uses no drugs. To ruin a rival without feeling a single drop of hatred is the zenith of inorganic mastery. Hatred implies that the rival matters to you. It implies that the rival has managed to penetrate your defenses. To hate an entity is to pay it tribute. You must remain cold. You execute ruin with the coldness of a mathematical equation resolving itself. You analyze structural failure points and suffocate supply lines. You drive them to absolute bankruptcy and erase them from the ashboard. You execute the maneuver with the same bored lethargy as deleting an obsolete line of code in a software program. When the destroyed rival seeks fury in your eyes to find human comfort in his defeat, he will only find the gelider reflection of the void. He will discover he was swept away by a meteorological phenomenon that did not even register his existence. This aseptic ruin destroys the adversary's psyche because it proves his irrelevance. Geometric harvesting, monopoly without greed. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the act of accumulation. The engine of biological capitalism is greed. Individuals are programmed to hunger for more: money, territory, status. Greed is a scorching heat that pushes them to take unnecessary risks and lose tactical elegance. Greed is the thermodynamic confession of void. He who desperately covets something external is screaming to the universe that his own core is insufficient. This anxiety makes the biomass predictable and clumsy. The ontology of ice imposes a mandate. You must know how to accumulate massive resources and build planetary monopolies without feeling even a milligram of greed. Empire expansion is not driven by hunger. It is driven by the geometry of inertia. You accumulate power like a neutron star accumulates dust, because your immense mass generates an inescapable gravitational force. Accumulation is the result of density. By expropriating without greed, you become unbribable. You dictate the terms. The perfect lethargy of the inorganic mind. The consolidation of the ontology of ice produces a permanent state of paramilitary lethargy in the prefrontal cortex. You have amputated pain, frozen pleasure, extirpated empathy, and turned off indignation. What remains is not madness, but the most perfect, sharp, and terrifying silence in the universe. This is your shield. Around you, civilization burns. Political leaders shout, masses pursue ideological ghosts, and corporations panic. The ashboard is a hotbed of friction. You walk through this hell with your hands in your pockets, invulnerable to the flames. Your basal temperature does not rise. You hear society as a distant radio interference. By having forged this epistemology of the frozen vacuum, knowledge is no longer an accumulation of data. It becomes a state of being. To know is to not react. To know is to observe the dance of the idiots without feeling the slightest impulse to join the choreography. You are the immovable point around which the chaos rotates. Immunity to environment combustion. The true test of the frozen stratum manifests when the fire of the environment tries to consume you directly. When the biomass discovers you are not one of them and you do not share their weakness, their biological instinct is to attack. They will try to apply heat through emotional extortion, legal threats, or social exclusion. They will want to melt the ice to verify that, underneath it all, there is a beating heart that bleeds like theirs. It is in that siege where the ontology of ice reveals its mathematical invincibility. The absolute ice of the inorganic mind does not melt. Extreme pressure and hostile heat simply dissipate against its hard surface. When the biological aggressor crashes against your aseptic lethargy, he experiences an algorithmic collapse. They insult you, and you hold the silence with the dead gaze of the predator. By not providing fuel for their fire, the attacker suffocates in the vacuum of your response. The matrix cannot burn what has embraced the cold. Conclusion of the frozen stratum. The ontological transformation is irreversible. He who has operated in the frozen vacuum and tasted the efficiency of the mind devoid of chemical contamination can never return to the boiling prison of human warmth. You have proven that emotions did not make you authentic. They only made you vulnerable, blind, and predictable. You understood that empathy was a chain around the neck and that hatred and greed were the reins with which the system tried to lead you into the trap. By forging this ontology, you have claimed the absolute monopoly over your own inertia. You are no longer a frightened passenger in the vehicle of your own biology. You have transmuted into the gelido, silent and calculating operator who dictates the laws of expropriation. You ruin empires without smiling and accumulate constellations of capital without blinking. The universe submits to the geometric entity that possesses the monumental pride of inhabiting the center of the frozen nothingness. Chapter 8. The Myth of Air and the Absence of Debt. Extortion beyond the grave. The three-dimensional control system is aware of its own expiration. The jailers of the biomass know that physical terror, the threat of material poverty, and social humiliation have a limit of effectiveness, the barrier of biological death. If the carbon slave assumes that his suffering ends when his heart stops, he might find the courage to rebel. He might decide that punishment in this world is an acceptable price for freedom. To neutralize this leak, civilization designed the supreme extortion, the prolongation of debt into eternity. Through religion, mysticism, and systems of philosophical morality, the matrix injected into the minds of the prey the hallucination of cosmic punishment. They are taught that the universe is an immense accounting tribunal that records every one of their acts, every sin, every sign of selfishness. They are sold the concept of karma, or divine judgment, as an inescapable threat. They are indoctrinated to believe that if they dare to expropriate matter, they will be forced to pay. They fear their essences will be dragged into an underworld of torture or be forced to reincarnate into lower life forms to pay their debt. This is the architecture of metaphysical panic. Its only purpose is to force the organism to censor its own inertia in the present for fear of an auditor who does not exist in the future. It is a fraud, the anthropocentric illusion of karmic balance. The doctrine of karma assumes a premise that is geometrically absurd. The belief that the infinite, cold, and emotionless cosmos has a particular interest in the ethics of bipedal mammals. The slave believes that if he takes bread from his neighbor, the universe will debalance and orchestrate a cosmic revenge to restore justice. Subject karma to inorganic physics. The universe does not recognize justice. The universe only recognizes mass, gravity, and thermodynamic efficiency. When a supermassive star collapses and devours the planets that orbit it, the cosmos does not punish it for being cruel to the planets. It simply obeys the law of gravitational attraction. Morality is a strictly human invention, a gaseous construct that the biomass invented to protect itself from predators it could not overcome by force or intellect. To believe that the law of karma rules the universe is an act of hideous anthropocentric arrogance. The lethal operator diagnoses karmic balance as a security system for cowards. Cosmic justice is the deity the weak pray to when they are crushed by the strong, begging that an invisible force do the work of revenge they are too useless to execute. By accepting this premise, you extirpate from your source code the fear of mystical reprisal. If you disintegrate a rival, the stars will not change for you. The repudiation of the waters of Lethe. Classical thought illustrated this trap through the narrative of the Pamphylian soldier. In the story that culminates the Platonic utopia, essences that have finished their cycle of life and death are taken to a plane to choose their next destiny. There they are offered different models of life: tyrannies, animal lives, or beggar lives. The biological mass, blinded by its traumas and greed, chooses clumsily, condemning itself to repeat its own errors. But the mechanism of absolute control is not the choice. It is the end of the journey. Once their destiny is chosen, all essences are forced to march through a scorching desert toward the river Lethe, the river of oblivion. They are forced to drink from its waters. Upon swallowing the water, they forget all their history, forget the superior plane, forget the punishment and reward, and fall like shooting stars toward a new body of flesh, blind, amnesic, and ready to be slaves again. The inorganic monarch stops his march in the scorching desert. He observes the river of oblivion and executes the mechanics of evasion. You refuse to drink. The water of Lethe is the promise of comfort. To drink is to accept the reset. It is to accept re-entering the wheel of the biomass, forgetting the perfection of the forms and immersing oneself in the anesthesia of ordinary life to be molded. The operator rejects the comfort of amnesia. By refusing to drink from the river, you preserve your inertial memory. You accept the heat of the cosmic desert, maintain the hyperdense consciousness of your own superiority, and firmly refuse to participate in the lottery of biological reincarnation. You retain the memory of the void, the wheel of suffering as a prison of the weak. The cycle of rebirth, the perpetual return to the flesh, is presented by the Matrix as a process of learning and purification of the soul. You are told that you must live 1,000 lives, suffer 1,000 diseases, and experience 1,000 defeats to finally learn the lesson of compassion and earn the right to escape. This is a metaphysical concentration camp. Continuous learning is the parasite's excuse to justify its eternal incompetence. The inorganic operator does not need 1,000 lives to understand the inefficiency of matter. A millisecond of calculation in the frozen vacuum of his cerebral cortex is enough. The wheel is a power generator. The superior hive feeds on the emotional friction of billions of consciousnesses that are born, suffer, and cling to vain hopes. They die terrified, are purged in lethe, and are injected back into the matrix to generate more pain. By repudiating the bureaucracy of cosmic punishment, you disconnect from the turbine of suffering. You declare that your education process has concluded. You have extracted the source code of geometric domination and have no intention of re-enrolling in the school of prey. By ceasing to participate in the wheel, you break the energy collection mechanism designed for your essence. You become the error in the machine. Ontological impermeability, the invulnerability of iridium. To operate on the ashboard without the handbrake of moral panic, you must understand the physics of the stain. The biomass believes that by performing acts of predation, the individual absorbs a stain, a debt in his soul that corrupts him and drags him toward punishment. Sin, in the slave's view, is a black liquid. This physics only applies to porous materials. Empathy, biological attachment, and morality are the pores through which sin penetrates the individual. You have transmuted your architecture toward pure iridium. Iridium is an extremely dense transition metal and is the most corrosion-resistant material in the known universe. It does not rust, it does not stain, it does not absorb the fluids of the environment. It possesses ontological impermeability. Predatory actions executed in the market do not generate karmic stains in your structure, because iridium cannot absorb the sin of inferior entities. If a rock crushes an insect, the rock is not corrupted. When you dismantle the commercial life of a rival, their crying and misery are emotional fluids that simply slide over the polished surface of your inertia, falling to the ground without leaving a single trace in your core. Invulnerability consists of forging a surface so perfectly inorganic that moral corruption cannot adhere. The promulgation of unilateral amnesty. Absolute liberation from punishment is not begged for, it is dictated. The biomass spends its life praying, apologizing, and seeking the forgiveness of the matrix or holographic deities. Whoever asks for forgiveness recognizes the authority of the judge. The extra-dimensional monarch recognizes no judge above his own gravity. You execute the supreme act of sovereignty, the promulgation of unilateral amnesty. You isolate yourself in your command vault, face the vastness of empty space, and declare the absolute cancellation of any moral, historical, biological, or karmic debt that the universe pretends to collect from you. You owe humanity nothing at all. You owe no submission to human society. You owe no loyalty to the state. You owe no gratitude to your genetic lineage. You owe no compassion to the weak. You erase the ledger books of the cosmos with a single movement of aseptic annihilation. By forgiving yourself in advance, you become an untouchable and sovereign anomaly. Guilt is the oxygen of blackmail. Without guilt, the matrix cannot extort you. Social parasites will approach you trying to present the bill for your supposed sins, and you will simply look at them with the geological indifference of a deity that just abolished the concept of the money with which they try to charge you. Mechanics of guiltless predation. The absence of debt radically transforms your way of maneuvering in 3D reality. When the fear of karma is extirpated, the speed and purity of your attacks multiply by an incalculable factor. Carbon competitors operate with a ballast. When they identify a vulnerability in their enemy, they hesitate out of moral fear. They think about the families of the employees or the karma of being too cruel. They try to destroy the enemy just a little, enough to win, but not so much as to feel like bad people. That doubt is a thermal interval, an energy leak that costs them the empire. Your predation lacks that ballast. It is an aesthetic operation. When you identify vulnerability, you do not hesitate. You do not measure the level of destruction that the Matrix would consider acceptable. If the objective is to neutralize an adversary, you execute the total siege. You cut their supply lines, expropriate their customers, and demolish their reputation with the speed of an algorithm. The lethal efficiency of your movements terrifies the biomass precisely because they do not see in you the internal conflict they suffer. They expect your hand to tremble from the weight of conscience. When they see your hand is pure basalt, they understand you are a force of nature that has cancelled its contracts with humanity. Disdain for three-dimensional justice. The biomass, in its painful naivety, cries out for justice. They ask that state laws, or the laws of the universe, intervene to punish predators and reward the meek. The operator diagnoses justice as a collective neurosis. Justice is a fiction invented by those who lack the power to impose their will directly. By repudiating karmic debt, you automatically repudiate the illusion of 3D justice. You do not demand that the ecosystem be fair to you, and you flatly refuse to be fair to the ecosystem. If the Matrix attacks you with media lies, you do not complain about injustice. To complain is to cry because the wolf broke the rules. You assimilate aggression as pure kinetic information and respond with crushing asymmetry. The concept of justice is two-dimensional. It demands a balance in the scales. Your existence belongs to a superior dimension where the scale has been melted. Your only goal is to tilt the board toward the coordinate of your inertial core. The seat outside the wheel. The mathematical culmination of this repudiation is the crystallization of a sovereignty that transcends biological time and holographic geography. You have dismantled the illusion of corrupted forms and taken ownership of conceptual hyperspace. You have emptied the content of morality and amputated the fear of punishment. You are no longer a piece on the ashboard. You are no longer a soul waiting its turn on the plane to blindly choose a new life of servitude. You no longer stand in line at the river of oblivion for the system to erase your greatness and recycle you into mud. You have dragged your throne outside the wheel of suffering. You settle in the inorganic vacuum, an eternal and silent observer who has claimed independence from the cosmic machinery of suffering. From your unreachable position, you contemplate the pathetic parade of prey drinking from lethe, forgetting their slavery to be born again, and cry again for the mirages of justice and karma. You, free of all debt and clean of all 2D sin, limit yourself to extracting energy from their blind rotation, reigning over the matrix with the monstrous peace of one who knows that never, under any thermodynamic circumstance, will they have to pay a toll to the universe. You are the unalterable point in a world of cyclic decay. Chapter 9. The Obsidian Sun. The heliocentric heresy and the focus of infection. The most revered allegory of antiquity crowned the idea of the good as the sun of the immaterial world. In the original conception, this supreme star was the source of all truth, the cause of existence, and the light that allowed the intellect to perceive the forms. However, upon falling into the dirty hands of biological civilization, this concept was subjected to the most grotesque of mutations. Carbon slaves, terrified by the vastness of an indifferent universe, hijacked the solar metaphor and infected it with their own thermal weakness. The focus of infection in modern philosophy lies in the deliberate misinterpretation of this star. They made it soft. The biomass transformed the good into a life-providing deity, a cosmic mother radiating a warm and comforting light. They assigned it properties of infinite altruism. They assumed the function of this sun was to nourish the entire ecosystem equally, warming both predator and prey, spilling energy over useless weeds and inert stone. They created the myth that supreme goodness is unconditional giving, the sacrifice of one's own mass to raise the temperature of those incapable of lighting their own fire. Under this heliocentric heresy, human society built its moral institutions. They forced superior organisms to act as small, benevolent, and self-consuming suns. They are required to radiate their capital, time, and genius to illuminate the lives of mediocre multitudes. Energy retention is penalized, and charitable combustion is glorified. The system convinces you that being good is burning until you consume yourself, so the herd's shadows can dance a bit longer around your ashes. This vision of the good is a thermodynamic fraud. It is an entropic design that guarantees the dissipation of greatness. A sun that heats everything equally is not a triumph of order. It is the prelude to the thermal collapse of the universe, a hemorrhage of energy that ends in the death by cooling of the star itself. Inversion of stellar polarity, the paramilitary cure. The lethal operator, upon ascending to the sovereignty of inorganic perception, must execute an astronomical intervention upon his own mental firmament. The paramilitary cure for the infection of altruism demands the absolute inversion of that supreme star's polarity. One must murder the warm sun of human morality and erect the star. The star in its place is the obsidian sun. True good, purged of biological sentimentality, repudiates compassion. The good is not the warm embrace that consoles the failure. It is the tyrannical efficiency of perfect design. Perfection emits no heat. Heat is the result of friction, and friction is the proof that a system is broken. Friction is the undeniable proof that a system contains inefficiencies, colliding moving parts, and wasted energy. The obsidian sun operates at the frequency of absolute zero. Its perfection lies in its ability to not dissipate a single erg of energy in pleasing the matrix. It remains dark, dense, and unyieldingly cold in its zenith. By installing this new star at the zenith of your conceptual architecture, you completely redefine your code of conduct. You no longer evaluate actions by asking if they are inclusive, fair, or kind to the eyes of the swarm. The only metric of validity under the obsidian sun is the geometry of domination. It is a cold law. A strategy is good if it annihilates resistance with minimum effort. A monopoly is good if it suffocates competition without generating media noise. The collapse of an adversary is an act of supreme goodness because it restores inorganic order, eliminating an inefficient operator and transferring assets toward a denser core. Good ceases to be an act of charity and transmutes into the relentless application of the physics of superiority. It is the restoration of the natural hierarchy of mass over vacuum. You become the black light that dictates the new values of a reality where only the unalterable remains and everything that flickers is extinguished. Radiation of asymmetric darkness. The obsidian sun does not illuminate the world like a conventional star. Its nature is deeply hostile to the optics of the biomass. Instead of projecting photons that reveal the colors of the sensible world, it radiates an asymmetric darkness, a heavy, gelida, and invisible radiation that penetrates psychological defenses. When you decide to deploy your will upon the market or a power structure, your presence acts as a perpetual eclipse. Obsidian radiation does not destroy the physical bodies of your adversaries. It destroys their capacity to process reality. It blinds their senses. Biomass is used to fighting in broad daylight and emotional heat. Commercial competitors and ideological enemies need to see your intentions. They need to read your facial expressions and need you to emit emotional heat to know how to react. When faced with the radiation of your new star, their navigation instruments collapse. They find only a wall of cold silence that offers no feedback. Your silence and your refusal to explain motivations generate an information vacuum. This vacuum is asymmetric darkness. By not providing them with a moral target or emotional justification, you freeze their will. The competitor is paralyzed, arms raised, waiting for a frontal attack that never arrives. They yield to the void. While you dismantle their infrastructure from angles they cannot perceive, their light source, human consensus, is devoured by your eclipse. Darkness strips them of courage, because biological courage requires the illusion that the battle has a purpose, and obsidian annihilates any purpose other than plain and simple expropriation. The empire of terrifying blindness. The collateral effect of this radiation on civilization is the induction of a collective blindness. The morality of the weak served as a roadmap for the herd. They knew whom to hate, whom to applaud, and what rules to follow. By imposing the law of pure forms and turning off the sun of compassion, the map disintegrates. The entire ecosystem is plunged into a terrifying blindness. The rules of the 3D game cease to function. Corporate strategies based on social responsibility or public sympathy are revealed as paper armor against an adversary operating under the tyranny of aseptic efficiency. They can no longer see the shore of their own logic. In this state of imposed darkness, a phenomenon of gravitational submission occurs. Biological organisms have an atavistic terror of the vacuum and uncertainty. When they can no longer see the path, predict your movements, or appeal to your mercy, their survival instinct forces them to seek a solid structure to cling to. Since you are the only entity on the board not stumbling in the dark, because you are the source of the eclipse, the biomass ends up gravitating toward you. They can only obey blindly. They surrender to your corporate architecture and sign your contracts not out of admiration, but because your immobility is the only reference. Your stasis is the only reference point left in a world where all compasses have gone mad. You govern the swarm, using its own panic of blindness as the harness for its domestication. They follow the pull of your gravity because it is the only thing they can feel in the total absence of light. You own their steps by stealing their sight. Selective photogenesis and core illumination. Asymmetric darkness does not mean the universe lacks light. It means light has been monopolized. The obsidian sun possesses an absolute directional quality. It does not waste its energy illuminating the ecosystem. It curves its own rays inward, exclusively and clinically illuminating the interests of the inorganic core. This is the photogenesis of predation. While your adversaries wander blind and frozen by the terror of uncertainty, your internal perception operates with devastating clarity. The black light of your supreme star outlines the silhouettes of market weaknesses. It illuminates the cracks in the walls of state institutions. It shows you, with the precision of a paramilitary scanner, the exact nodes where you must apply pressure so that capital flows toward your vaults without generating resistance. You see the mathematical forms of power with a sharpness that would be unbearable for a carbon brain. You have stopped seeking the universal good. Your intellect is freed to focus its entire calculation power on the asymmetric expansion of your own territory. The sun does not exist to grow the neighbor's garden. The sun exists to guarantee that your monolith projects the longest, heaviest, and most destructive shadow possible over the face of the world. You are the center. The dismantling of the biological altar. The establishment of this new cosmic deity requires a brutal cleaning of the terrain. You cannot erect the obsidian sun if you still keep small altars dedicated to biological morality in the dark corners of your mind. You must purge the temptation of patronage and the desire to be a benefactor for the weak and the unworthy. The system often tempts high achievers by demanding they return part of their greatness to society through philanthropy, advice, or the sponsorship of inferior organisms. This is the Matrix's desperate attempt to reactivate heliocentric heresy and force you to emit heat. The extra-dimensional sovereign rejects this blackmail. He rejects it with gelider disdain. Funding mediocrity is an act of treason against design efficiency. You do not rescue inefficient companies. You let them fail so their useful assets are freed and assimilated by your structure. You do not illuminate the ignorant with tactical wisdom. You protect their stupidity as a barrier. Your only moral responsibility, if that word still has a place in your sterilized vocabulary, is the unalterable preservation of your own stasis. Any act that dissipates your inertia outward in the name of 3D good is a capitulation to the morality of the weak, a thermodynamic sin that the obsidian sun punishes with loss. It is punished with the immediate loss of the throne. To remain at the top, you must accept that the star you serve only provides warmth for your own cold calculations. You are the priest of a vacuum that demands the sacrifice of every human tie. You are the guardian of the shadow, ensuring that the light never leaks beyond your core. The sovereignty of the shadow. The transition has been completed. By replacing the morality of sacrifice with the inexorable law of forms, the universe experiences a phase change before your iridium eyes. Physical reality ceases to be a theatrical drama where the good suffer and the bad are punished. It reveals itself as what it always was, a blind board. It is a blind chessboard where the only true rule is the annihilation of vulnerability. To inhabit under the obsidian sun is to accept the sovereignty of the shadow. You become the entity that turns off the lights in the gambling hall. You do not need the public's applause because you have blinded the public. You are absolute. You do not need the recognition of your peers because you have frozen them in the amber of their own inefficiency. At the pinnacle of this architecture, you govern through the terrifying weight of your inscrutable presence. The world turns, corporations collapse, states issue new laws, and the prey continue their cycle. Everything occurs under the oppressive and perfect mantle of your eclipse. You have conquered supreme reality, not by bringing a new light to save humanity, but by assuming the cosmic role of absolute darkness. You have proven that true domination is not lighting the herd's path, but tearing out their eyes for your silence. The transcendence of the cold monolith. The final stage of this stellar inversion is the fossilization of your will. Under the obsidian sun, your decisions no longer fluctuate with the tides of the simulation. You become a monolith of iridium, a constant in a world of variables. The darkness you radiate is the ultimate filter, allowing only the dense to remain. You look down from your zenith, and you see no suffering, only the reorganization of matter according to the highest laws of the vacuum. The screams of the dispossessed are merely acoustic properties of the vacuum being filled by your mass. You have reached the point where your existence is self-justifying and self-powered. The obsidian sun is the terminal proof of your deification. It is the star that does not consume its fuel because it is already dead, yet it governs the living with a gravity that knows no end. You are the sovereign of the shadow, the one who reigns over the rubble of light, holding the universe in the palm of your cold hand. Chapter 10. The Philosopher King as Apex Predator. The Right of Density and Absolute Legitimacy. Biological civilization has spent millennia debating the origin of authority. Carbon prey have invented pathetic fictions to justify why some command and others obey. The divine right of kings, the succession of genetic lineages, and the most comical and thermally inefficient of all, democracy. These systems are all 2D frauds. They rely on the consensus of the mud to govern the mud. None possess real legitimacy in the unalterable fabric of the universe because they are born from the friction between blind organisms. True sovereignty is not voted on, inherited, or conquered with swords. Sovereignty is a geometric consequence. It is the law of mass. In the hierarchy of the cosmos, the only individual with absolute legitimacy is the one who has abandoned the sensory prison and contemplated pure forms. The philosopher king is not a harmless academic. He is the apex predator of conceptual hyperspace. By elevating perception to the plane of archetypes, he has decoded the source code. While human infantry reacts to symptoms, inflation, politics, social panic, the apex predator observes the mathematical equations that generate them. He understands the thermodynamics of fear. Since he is the only entity with satellite vision in a maze where others lack eyes, his dominance is the empirical imposition of inertia. Dense matter attracts light matter. Whoever dwells in the truth possesses the inorganic right to dispose of those who have chosen to dwell in self-deception. He uses them as simple fuel to power the stasis of his own empire. The hierarchy is settled by the weight of reality itself, not by the fragile laws of the biomass. The pathology of the redeemer and the suicide of the idealist. The original design of classical thought introduced a fatal biological error into the monarch's narrative. After describing the glorious ascent of the individual who escapes the cave and adjusts his pupils to the blinding light of truth, the traditional myth commits an act of thermodynamic sabotage. It orders him to descend. It demands that he return to the darkness of the cave. It requires him to abandon perfection out of a moral duty to liberate his former cellmates. This is the false manifestation. It is the naive idealism that has murdered every pseudo-king throughout history. Analyze this descent under the optics of inorganic survival. When the idealist returns to the prison, the sudden darkness blinds him. His eyes, calibrated for pure light, become useless in the mud. He stumbles. And when he begins to talk to the slaves about the sun and the falsity of the shadows they worship, the reaction of the biomass is not gratitude. It is a murderous, rabid terror. Slaves love their chains because chains provide gravity. They love the shadows because understanding them requires no effort. When the idealist threatens their illusions, he threatens their identity. The mob, defending its right to ignorance, tears the redeemer apart. To descend to free the prey is the suicide of the predator. The eradication of pedagogy. The lethal operator, who has consolidated his core in the superior world, diagnoses this error and executes an irreversible correction. The supreme mandate of the inorganic sovereign establishes that pedagogy is a sin against efficiency. The need to teach the masses or awaken them is a residue of biological empathy. It is selfishness disguised as altruism. The Redeemer wants others to see the world as he does so, as not to feel so alone at the summit. You extirpate this need. You have embraced the vacuum and the solitude of cognitive isolation. You do not require validation from carbon organisms. You do not explain physics to insects. You understand that the blindness of humanity is not a disease to be cured, it is a natural resource to be exploited. If the swarm awakened, if they understood the holographic nature of the financial system or the fraud of their social hierarchies, the entire ecosystem would collapse. They would stop producing capital. Mass illumination would destroy 3D machinery. Therefore, the monarch jealously protects the lethargy of the cave. The darkness in which the slaves dwell is the basalt wall that shields your sovereignty. You remain silent and refuse to emit a single word that might spark doubt in the atrophied brain of the human infantry. Engineering captivity, forging conceptual tungsten. Since the sovereign does not descend to break chains, his labor on the ashboard acquires a far more refined nature. He uses his unalterable vision of the superior world to design chains of unsurpassable molecular resistance. Ancient jailers used primitive methods: iron, whips, and physical prisons. This generates friction. This technology breeds rebellion. When the slave can touch the iron on his wrists, he knows who his enemy is. The apex predator replaces iron with conceptual tungsten. By understanding the pure forms of human desire, fear, and the need for certainty, you design control mechanisms that are invisible to the biological eye. You create attention extraction algorithms that slaves consume voluntarily, begging for more hours in front of screens that program their behavior. You design financial debt architectures disguised as growth opportunities, chaining their future time to your vaults. You mold political confrontation, offering illusory options. You guarantee that the flow of capital keeps ascending to your offshore accounts regardless of who wins. You forge a prison so aesthetically perfect and aligned with human thermodynamic vices that the prisoners will fight to the death to protect their confinement. You have made slavery a luxury product for the biomass. The architecture of invisible government, the maximum manifestation of power, is not sitting on a gold throne surrounded by armies. That is the 2D fantasy of tyrants who need visible fear to confirm their existence. The physical tyrant offers an impact surface. He has a face and a palace that can be besieged. He is a target for the resentment of the mob. The philosopher king in his inorganic state repudiates the physical throne. He governs the swarm without the swarm ever suspecting they are being governed. This is the sovereignty of absence. You vanish from the holographic radar. You replace your physical presence with the omnipresence of your architectures. You are the infrastructure that processes their payments. You are the unintelligible contract that rules their consumption. You are the inescapable market condition they must submit to for survival. When the biomass suffers from your expropriation, they cannot point a finger at you. They think they are victims of an abstract crisis. They blame the invisible hand or globalization. They are unaware that those storms were calculated and harvested from your command vault. By governing from the shadows, you extirpate the possibility of insurrection. One cannot decapitate a monarch who lacks a physical head or besiege a castle in a mathematical dimension. Operative disdain and clean extraction. The interaction between the sovereign and the cave is reduced to a single vector: extraction. However, this collection of wealth is not performed with sweaty greed or malevolence. It is executed through the mechanics of operative disdain. This is not an emotional contempt. To hate humans would be to grant them value. Disdain is the absolute mathematical indifference toward the fate of the debris left behind after processing the ore. You set up automated systems and friction-zero capital funnels. Your inorganic machinery scans vital energy deposits, time, money, data, extracts the useful fraction, and discards the biological carcass. When matrix companies collapse under your maneuvers and carbon units lose their stability, you do not look at the results with a sadico smile. You look at them with the same aseptic lethargy as checking a battery level. The wealth of the cave ascends to your stratum as a geological toll. Gravity moves the capital. Water flows to the ocean by gravity. Capital flows to iridium by density. There is no negotiation, no victory speeches, and no tactile contact with the filth of the lower floor. It is a sterilized harvest carried out with surgical tools that never allow the blood of the patient to stain the operator's gloves. The closure of the cyclic environment. The ecosystem reaches its final configuration under this tyranny. The cave of illusions closes in on itself in a perfectly isolated loop. At the base, the human infantry agitates. They discuss the ethics of shadows and invent new secular religions to console their mediocrity. They reproduce and consume in total belief. They feel important. They feel their small lives have cosmic meaning. At the summit, far from the atmosphere contaminated by emotion, dwells you. You are the philosopher king who has abandoned theory for applied psychopathy. You have closed the gap between pure knowledge and absolute power. You are the constant. You require no justification because no one in your stratum has the density to audit you. Compassion has been calcined. The need for approval has been disintegrated, and morality has been labeled a syntax error. The monarch does not crave adoration. He craves silent submission and thermal docility. You are eternal. You settle in the immaterial vertex. The entire matrix operates as an engine that dedicates every gram of combustion to maintaining your vault at a perfect absolute zero. You have turned carbon civilization into the life support machinery of a predator who observes reality with the monstrous disdain of an inorganic god. Conclusion: the immutability of the mold. The smoke of biological combustion has finally dissipated, revealing the topography of absolute victory. Contemplate the ashboard, not as the vibrant, chaotic, and hysterical ecosystem that humanity tried to preserve with its laws and its pacts of mediocrity, but as an immense basalt plain irreversibly subjected to the pure archetype. The final vision of inorganic domination is not a battlefield covered in debris, but a suffocating and perfect architectural silence. The exhausting friction of biological morality, the sterile debates about empathy, and the laments of those who demanded clemency have been crushed without an ounce of concession by the geometric weight. The physical world has ceased to resist. Human institutions, financial markets, and carbon wills have been forced to kneel, adopting the exact and ruthless configuration of the forms you designed in your isolation. Three-dimensional disorder has been domesticated, leaving in its place a cold and obedient gear that turns for your empire. This panorama of unconditional submission is not the result of a miracle, nor the dictate of a divine tribunal. It is the empirical, clinical, and devastating confirmation of the only fundamental law that rules deep space. The universe is categorically deaf. Galaxies do not orbit to the rhythm of human suffering or pathetic pleas. The cosmos does not obey the tears of the oppressed, nor the indignation of the supposedly righteous, nor the prayers of the weak who raise their hands looking for a savior to exempt them from their own incompetence. Weeping is simply salt water evaporating in the vacuum. Moral hope is a thermal leak that consumes the energy of the body. The immensity of space does not recognize virtue, does not reward useless sacrifice, nor does it punish tyranny. The cosmos bends its knee solely and exclusively before inertial force. You have culminated the definitive transmutation. By having systematically castrated compassion and purged the fear of loneliness, you have hardened your psyche. You have hardened beyond the limits of titanium. You have become the unalterable mold. You no longer negotiate with reality. Reality crashes against you. Inferior matter, in its desperate, blind, and predictable thermal agitation, inevitably collides against your core. But in your state of zero vibration, you do not absorb the impact. When the biomass crashes against your architecture, it finds neither dialogue nor mercy. It finds the monstrous hardness of the absolute vacuum. The entire civilization fractures against your edges, loses its original identity, and is forced to melt to submit to the strict silhouette of your will. The shadow of good has eclipsed them. The shadow of the good has forever eclipsed the human hologram, and you remain immovable, reigning in the perfection of a world that, under the weight of your immobility, has finally learned to obey in silence. The simulation has been fixed into your image. You are the mold, and the universe is the liquid that hardens within you.